Hello, students. I hope that everyone is safe and healthy. This lecture will cover chapters 1 and 2 of the book Daytripper. If you have not yet ordered Daytripper, please remember that links to purchase the book can be found on the Blackboard website. The book also has a digital version that you can also buy. The digital version is perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable for you to use for any readings and future assignments. So let's take a look at our authors. Right? Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba are twin brothers, pictured here. They are Brazilian. They have written and drawn quite a few very successful comics outside of Daytripper. The one that you may know most recently is Gabriel Ba was the artist on Umbrella Academy. They did not work on it together, but one of them worked on that. They've worked a lot with authors like Matt Fraction and a bunch of people. Some of their more common themes are family, especially strained relations, dealing with isolation, depression, and the idea of destiny. So let's take a look at the book that we will read. The book you have in front of you, Daytripper, was published originally as 10 individual comics in 2010 from February to November. So just as a small note, if you are going to purchase the book, make sure you are purchasing the graphic novel. It will be a book. It will not be a single issue of a comic. It's considered one of the more famous and best contemporary comics of the past few years. And the year it was published, it won a bunch of major graphic novel awards. Think of it as the Oscar winner of 2010. So now that brief introduction is out of the way, let's take a look at the protagonist of our book. This is Brás de Olívio Domingos' book. He will be your main character for almost every chapter. He will be the focal point for you, the reader, in almost every chapter. A little bit about him. He very much wants to be a writer. He is the son of a famous Brazilian novelist, and you will see him throughout all stages of his life. Pictured here on the left, you can see kind of a representation of various comic panels. So one of the things that I think you should think about is, why do we follow these Brás characters? And yes, there are characters. There are many different versions of Brás that you will meet throughout this book. So ask yourself, why do you think these authors chose him, in particular, to be their main character or characters? We will also very clearly see how Brás, as an individual, develops themes of life, family, and love, and how all of those ideas change as a person ages. So, as we mentioned before, Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba are Brazilian, and Daytripper presents many Brazilian influences regarding language, literature, and culture. All of the book takes place in Brazil, at various different areas of Brazil, and it is very much indebted and wants to present to you parts of Brazilian culture. Right? We can even see it in our name, Brás or Brasil. The name also references Brás Cubas in the book The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, in which the premise of this book is that the author is a dead man who is, as you can see from the cover of the book, at the day of his death, he is dead and he is casting back and looking back at his life. That's why they're the posthumous memoirs. He's already dead, thinking back over his life that he has lived. One of the other things to note about Daytripper, our book, is that we will also see various settings taking place across Brazil, and we will have a couple historical and cultural references to Brazilian history and culture in the book. So, make sure before you read Daytripper that you take a look at the foreword. You might consider this the first page of the novel. This foreword, created for the graphic novel version, I believe, was by Craig Thompson, who is himself an artist. That's why it's drawn in one page. He is the author of a graphic novel called Blankets. I will bet you if you go to, when you're able to go to your next trip to Barnes & Noble, if you go to the graphic novel section, you will see a copy of Blankets. It's a very popular graphic novel. This foreword is helpful because it sets up and introduces a lot of the central themes of the book. It will help you see what Moon and Ba are trying to do with those themes. So go ahead and turn to it, pause the video, and let's read it. They call Brazil the country of the future, thriving, vibrant, bursting with energy and life, just like the story of Brazilian twins Moon and Ba. You can't help but get lost in these drawings, but then the narrative forces you to question. Does art enhance our lives or distract from it? The world of comics has long been divided between two schools, fantasy versus realism. The superhero is escapist, the dream, clearly a distraction. But the other is its own abstraction, distilling the life to its most mundane, suppressing the dream with cynicism. Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon dance between both, infusing reality with the sacred. Daytripper is an honest mediation on mortality. But as the protagonist Brás de Olivia Domingos says, writing about death was easy enough. There's far more happening in these pages, pondering the past, wishing for the future, but existing foremost in the experience. I like Thompson's introduction because it helps set up for us very clearly the idea that this book is an honest meditation on mortality. That writing about death might be easy enough, but Moon and Ba have more to say about our life. Okay, so on to some of the key themes to pay attention to as you read this book. So, some of the key things to look for as you read this book. One of the things you should look at is the nature of family. So as you read, think about how family is a mutable concept. It changes all the time. Our relationships to our family, the members who we choose to be a part of our family. And most importantly, in terms of family, Moon and Ba want you to look at the role of masculinity in this concept of family, especially the relationship of father and son. Next, pay attention to the role nature plays in the graphic novel. Moon and Ba draw a strong contrast between nature versus city life. Time in nature for Brás is where he finds comfort, but also has personal revelations about himself, his place in the world, his place within his family. The city, however, is often a place where isolation and depression happens. Chart this tension between the role of nature and city and how they work in the graphic novel. Next up, the one you will find most clear is the nature of death. Moon and Ba want to do something more than just a standard reading that says, appreciate life while you live it, or live one life one day at a time. For them, death is unavoidable and chaotic, yet death only achieves its meaning by folding it into what we think of as a part of life. Death, like all things, changes depending on the person and the context. As you read the graphic novel and see the many deaths of Brás, our main character, ask yourselves how the deaths are different from each other and how they leave you feeling. Next up is truth. Throughout the book, Brás is searching for a meaning to his life. He's trying to find this truth in his work, in his loves, in his friendships, and his family. The journey of Brás is his attempt to find that the meaning and purpose of life might not be an absolute truth, but it could be a partial truth. It could be his truth. Now let's focus in on chapter 1. Right off the bat, we start with an introduction to our main character, Brás de Olivia de Domingos. We set the age for his character as well as the chapter title, and we really get an introduction to the relationship with his father, especially his father's legacy as a man of words, as it says in the newspaper, as a famous Brazilian author. Note, if you look up here on the upper right-hand corner in the panel on the top of the page, the big number you will see, all right, some students get confused of this. The big number you will see is not the chapter number. 32 will always represent Brás's age in the chapter you are reading. So here we have a man who is 32 years old. One of the things to note that this establishes, and one of the strongest parts of Moon and Ba's art, is the use of color. If you see the differences between the colors and the way that the eyes here are framed in this top panel, we get a sense that this is a flashback. So much of chapter 1 is Brás flashing back on the day that led him into that bar where he will get shot. Chart the use of color for Moon and Ba throughout the book, and see how that color helps give you a tone or feeling about what you are reading. This book is fantastically colored. It has lots of bright, vibrant colors. So chart and see how those colors make you feel while reading the book. Next up, chapter 1 also establishes Jorge, who is a key figure in the novel and is Brás's best friend. This conversation in chapter 1 helps set the stage for a lot of interrogations that will come further on in the book. This conversation sets up that Brás is unhappy with his career and his inability to write about life, or the things that make life worth living. Like many authors, Brás wants to write a book that will speak to people, that will give them and reflect some part of the shared experience we have as human beings on this planet. However, when the graphic novel begins, Brás is an obituary writer. Obituaries are written, usually published in a newspaper or online, that are the legacy and lives of a person who has passed. The first page of the graphic novel gives you 3 of these obituaries of various Brazilians. For Brás, writing these obituaries in this stage of the novel, for him, is all about death. He cannot see the lives of the people he's writing about. He can only see that they have passed, and for this makes him unfulfilled. As their conversation ends, however, Jorge tries to teach Brás and the reader one of the key themes of the book. Jorge tells him, "You know too well that death is a part of life, my friend, and so is family." This is the first meditation on one of the key existential arguments of Daytripper. What Jorge is trying to tell Brás here, even though Brás doesn't get it and us as the readers don't get it, is that death cannot be separated from life. It is a part of life, just like the lives of the people he writes in the obituaries cannot be solely reduced to the fact that they are dead. So death is embedded as a central part of what makes us human. Watch as this meditation on death and the way the nature of death changes throughout the book comes back to what Jorge says here on page 23. Death is a part of life, my friend. Remember that. As we go to the end of chapter 1, we have some other few key scenes, and again, tying back into one of the other central themes we talked about, the idea of the legacy of fathers and sons. The end of chapter 1 plays this out in an ironic tragedy. Brás himself is going to this celebration of his father's legacy and fame as an author, even though he himself is frustrated by that legacy as he has not written what he thinks is a great book. All right, so he meets the bar owner, Gennarinho, who inherited the bar from his father, and Brás asks him, well, you could just change the name, and Gennarinho says that it would still be his bar, and I would still be his son. So even though Gennarinho has taken over the bar and is running the bar, Gennarinho has more of a comfort in understanding that this is a sort of legacy of his father. And he feels more at peace, where Brás, as it says in there, says, well, we're all somebody's son, right? He undercuts it with an ironic claim, because Brás is unhappy about the legacy of his father. This idea of the legacies of fathers, the way fathers impact the nature of their sons, will become incredibly vital as we read the book. So, question. To help you understand Chapter 1, try and answer this in your notes. Look at Jorge and Brás. How will they discuss the role of life, writing, and death? How does this set the stage for the entire book? If you can kind of summarize our discussion here, you'll be on the right track. Now let's go to Chapter 2. One quick note. As you read the book, you will see these large splash pages. Right? Remember, at the beginning of the video, I told you that Daytripper was originally a series of single-issue comics that have now been put together in one graphic novel, in one larger book. So these pages that will have no writing on them, that will have no captions, that will have nothing on it, just one picture, think of these as separating the chapters. So you see this big splash page here. The very next page sets up Chapter 2. All right. As you read, always look for the Chapter 2, the chapter and age of Brás. It will appear in every chapter, though it may not appear always on the first page. It may come one or two pages in. They want to be artistic with it. Think of looking for the chapter and age of Brás. Think of that very much as the opening to Law and Order. You know it's coming soon, but you don't know exactly when it will happen. So let's turn to Chapter 2. We begin with Brás, with another Brás, or maybe the same Brás. We'll have to discuss that later on. But anyway, this Brás is younger than the one we saw in Chapter 1. He is 21 years old. Him and Jorge, fresh out of college, are on a vacation before they start what they would say, quote unquote, is their lives, i.e. returning back to work, finding a job, going on interviews, and trying to get on with life. One of the key things in Chapter 2 is we really see the role of nature in the book. Right? In Chapter 2, Brás is more reflective about who he is. He's thinking more about what it is to be alive and what's important in this natural and especially non-urban environment. The presence of nature, starting in Chapter 2, represents a space of self-reflection and growth, which is a key part of the theme of pastoralism found throughout the text. The pastoral is a literary genre in which the return to nature, a return to the quote-unquote simple life, is preferable to that found in urban environments. So we get our next major introduction of a key character. Ra and Moon develop Olinda, pictured here, to be idolized as a border crosser. She exists in both dreams and in reality. She is both a real person, you'll see her again in Chapter 3, and a manifestation of Imanja, who we'll talk about in a moment. Like Jorge, in Chapter 2, Olinda helps Brás learn about his life and think about what is truly important to him. Namely, she claims, if you travel too fast, all you're going to see is a blur, and you'll never really meet anyone interesting. So right here, she's commenting on the fact that with Brás traveling around, and tomorrow they leave for another area on their trip, she's saying, hey, if you go too fast, you won't meet any interesting people like her. So this sets up an interesting separation for Brás, where he will be torn between these quote-unquote interesting people and his career and his job and his quote-unquote real life. Next up, let's talk a bit about the festival of Imanja, that is the central scene of the chapter. It's pictured here on the right in these panels here with all the people in white putting the boats out and the sacrifices. Imanja is a goddess of the sea and the central deity in the Candomblé religion. She watches over sailors, fishermen, and controls their catches. Like many sea gods, she is both dangerous and life-sustaining. We get fish and life from the water, but it can also be a place of danger where you die. The Candomblé religion is wide and varied form of worship that came about in Brazil through the slave trade from West Africa in the 1600s. It's always important to remember that Brazil, is a colony country. Many slaves were brought over when Portugal colonized Brazil. This creates a huge diversity of religions and cultures, from Afro-Caribbean cultures all the way through to sort of more classic Latino Hispanics type cultures that we might think of, kind of almost seen in the picture of Brás himself. Traditionally, in this festival, people make shrines in the sand, offering presents of flowers, little beauty products, lipstick, jewelry, mirrors. If your gift is washed up on the shore, it is believed to be rejected by the goddess. And note, at the end of the chapter, Brás does not get washed up into shore. So Brás, in many ways, has been a gift that has been accepted by the goddess into the sea. Here are just some pictures of the festival, so you can see that this is a real thing, that Moon and Ba are drawing from their culture as Brazilians and representing it to you. You get an example of one of the offerings being put into the boat. So if we return to Olinda, Olinda again is referencing Irminja when Bas talks about his dreams on page 49 here. Dreams become an important element of the book, especially as we work towards the end of the story. Dreaming becomes a way for Brás to reflect on himself, reflect on his life, and kind of try and think about existence in a more spiritual manner. What we can see in this chapter, early on, in this case, in chapter 2, it is apparent that Brás has not thought that much about his dreams, except for the dream of his meeting with Irminja, which is, of course, his meeting with death. If you look over here, when she asks him, so, Olinda asks him, what are your dreams? He doesn't get to answer that. He doesn't have his dreams yet. He doesn't have a dream and a purpose in his life. Right? One of the things we will talk about later on is how dreams are a way to work through what Freud says is dream work. Right? One of the key elements that Moon and Ba borrow from a Freudian concept of dreams is that what you actually dream about is not what is actually the point. So, for instance, if you have a dream where your teeth fall out, this is not a dream telling you to go to the dentist. You work through the dream work to find out, you have this dream where your teeth are falling out. What is the anxiety? What is causing that? Moon and Ba will do the same thing as we progress through the book. Right? But here, right now, it's important to note, just as a reminder, Brás doesn't have any dreams to think about. He hasn't given time. He's too busy trying to move on with his life as opposed to thinking about what he might want to do with his life. So, as we approach the end of chapter 2, we see that Brás's death is less horrific than in chapter 1. The colors in the artwork are softer and brighter. Right? Look at the scene where his death is essentially happening, where the spirit of the boatman is telling him that he has died. Right? This is the moment of Brás's death being pictured here. Right? Compared to the harsh, violent ending in chapter 1, where he gets murdered, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting shot in that bar. Here we have a death that is abstracted. Right? It's almost spiritual. You almost don't even know it's happened until the next page where it tells you that it happens. Right? So, spoiler alert. In every chapter of this book, Brás is going to die. And one of the things that Moon and Ba as authors want you to think about, all right, is how these deaths provide context to each other, how they are different. Right? Think of these as parallel versions of Brás's life. Moments when he could have zigged or he could have zagged, or they're separate universes. Right? In this universe, we are seeing a death that is much more peaceful and abstract. We also get a strong sense of foreshadowing in this scene in terms of the dolls made that he and Olinda had, where he goes, you are not one, not like this, you are two, which references the fact that Brás dies here in chapter 2, but keep an eye out as to "You are not one, not like this, you are two" refers to Alinda and Brás later on in the novel. So, circling around to the end. So we had a very abstract moment where Brás drowns, right? And you're told here in the last pages of chapter 2. But look at this reading compared to the first one. Notice how the death here incorporates a natural cycle of death and rebirth. The narrator says, all right, remember, as we talked about, square here are captions, all right? And remember, if you watched the previous video on how to read comics, captions are the voice of the narrator. So this isn't a character, this is a obituary, all right? Some people like to think that maybe Brás is writing his own obituary or his spirit is. We don't know that. We can't say that with any sort of clear direction. But this is our narrator. Our narrator says, every year, the number of drowning victims during the festivities increases, as does the number of children conceived. So, and it says here at the end, evidencing that Irminja can give life as well as take it away. So compared to the death in chapter 1, Brás's death here by drowning is incorporated into a much broader sense of life and death as a circle of rebirth. All right? Every year, the number of drowning victims increases, so too does the number of children conceived. Right? People aren't dying more, nor are more people being born. They found kind of a natural harmony of life and rebirth. All right? A cycle of life and death, which embeds death more in a process of rebirth, making it less an end and more of a compulsive step in a symbiotic relationship of making life what it is. This is a key part of a sort of pastoral approach to life, right? That the natural rhythms of the natural world, which includes life and death, are always in harmony if they are in balance, right? And the ending of chapter 2 presents us a natural world that is in balance, with as many people dying as being born. So, one of the things to ask yourself if you reread chapter 2, especially pages 53 to 56, it's the discussion on the role of nature and the spiritual. Ask yourself and see if you can summarize. How does the death in chapter 2 feel different from the death in chapter 1? How does the role of nature help impact this change, both in the artwork, the beautiful colors, and the gorgeous tropical beach environment compared to the city? And how too does the cycle of life and death and the way nature has a pastoral cycle itself help enforce this? That is the introductions to chapter 1 and 2 of Daytripper. Next, we will look at chapters 3 and 4.